Welcome, everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Natalie Baker. I'm owner of the Neurofeedback Training Company and licensed psychotherapist. And I'm just thrilled to have Laura with us for this conversation about executive functioning skills, neurodivergence, the intersection between neurofeedback and using executive coaching for helping with ADHD and other issues. So, Laura, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Natalie.
absolutely. This is a really big topic. As I've mentioned to you before, we serve a lot of neurodivergent individuals and families with our neurofeedback training. And it's always a question of, where does the intersection between learning those skills and doing brain training, where do they come together? But before we get to that, I'd love to just talk a little bit about your background. I know you do the executive coaching for the neurodivergent community now, but maybe just share with us a little bit about your background and your passion and how you got into this.
Thank you very much. Yes. I was an executive recruiter for 12 years, and I recruited in various industries, various roles. And in 2008, I said, I've had enough, because 2008, we know what happened in 2008. And I started coaching and doing career coaching with a specialization in interview preparation. Because when I was a recruiter, I did full cycle recruiting, but I also, if I brought a candidate in for a client like Goldman Sachs, I would look at a resume and say, I think your resume could be beefed up a little bit, or how are your interview skills? I would always go above and beyond. So the piece for me that I really felt was my skill, I was highly skilled in, was being able to make an assessment how somebody interviews. And the interview is extremely important. If you don't get past the first interview, you don't get to the offer stage. So I did that for many years. I worked with, and my passion, I have worked with many young professionals, specifically, not only, but specifically with Rutgers Business School. I was brought on as a contract coach to be part of their mock interview program to see how their undergraduate students, how they would perform in an interview, because that's a very important piece. Once they're out of school, no one's holding their hand anymore. So I realized early on that I felt very connected to the students, the young professionals. I saw their issues even more so now. And I did that for about 9 years in person until COVID, and then I was doing it online. But I saw there was such a great need. And I connected with the students. I was highly ranked by the students because they had to, make an assessment about their time with me. So from there, I went on and I specialized in interview preparation. And how I came to executive functioning coaching, funnily enough, I have a sister who is in the Maine and Portsmouth, New Hampshire area, who is a couples therapist. And she had said to me one day, have you ever thought of working with people who may have ADHD? She said, I have a lot of couples who, a lot of the issues that they have in their relationships are because of their, poor or less than executive functioning skills, and the issues that they have around their ADHD or autism. And it sounded very interesting. I've had a couple of partners who had ADHD. I have a very good friend, and I've often felt, oh my goodness, there is so much need here. And I know so many of the issues that go along with when you do struggle with ADHD. And even when you don't have ADHD, there are a lot of struggles around executive functioning. All of us have them. So that's how I came into the executive functioning, specializing with people mostly who have ADHD, and I've worked with people who are on the spectrum.
Thank you for the introduction. So one of the questions that people often have is like, what kind of normal struggles with a busy life and being distracted with a cell phone and, difficulties in a relationship? And what are the signs that, no, this is really a level of challenge that could benefit from, executive coaching? If you could talk a little bit about kind of how are people presenting? What do you encourage people to bring to you that you feel is best served by, some executive coaching training?
Great question. I'll give an example right now. I've been working with a young man who he was an attorney and successful, extremely smart, but he couldn't perform his day to day because every day as an attorney there's some kind of deadline, and he would procrastinate and procrastinate, and that is the probably the executive function skill or lack of that most people struggle with. That is the really big one, and time management. And the upshot was that he knew that because he's a very honest person, and he was spinning out, and he decided to leave what he was doing, and he's looking at a different career at this point. But I'm working with him to set up routines with him so we can work on these skills. When it really interferes with your work, with your life, with your academic life, because I do work with, I've currently had two students who are in university, one who's currently in university. And how do you work through a curriculum where you have 24 hours of reading alone because you're in an extremely difficult school? How do you juggle that with all the other things that you have to juggle if you have issues with executive functioning? So when it starts to present an issue, and have been patterns throughout your life, some of these people, maybe they were not diagnosed or they were diagnosed with ADHD. And interestingly, once people do get diagnosed, it's a sense of relief. That's what the problem has been all along. I was wondering, because the majority of these people are so smart, so smart. Yeah. And they struggle so much. Did I answer your question correctly?
It sounds like when it's significantly impacting a major area of their life, whether it's work or school or relationship, that getting the support is so helpful because, as you said, they're very intelligent people and their brains don't work the way that sort of typical brain does. And so when you start to work with somebody, kind of what are the initial pieces of information that you like to connect or
usually in my introductory coaching session, I ask them, what's been going on? What have you been struggling with most? Where do you trip up? What does it look like when you try to perform at your work? Where do you get stuck? And often they're very open and transparent about it. What happens? What have you been doing? What have you been trying and that's not working? And obviously, if something's not working, you have to try something else. And one of the things that I think is, and it is a very major thing, I think, when someone comes to me and they say, I've been struggling with executive functioning, it's not just struggling with executive functioning, it's struggling with their self-view and all the things that go on in our heads, the stories and the narratives that we have. And often these people, in my experience, when I've worked with many of my clients, they have anxiety, they get overwhelmed easily, or they're depressed. Not all of it, sometimes it depends, but some people really, they struggle tremendously. And I think, for instance, this one particular client that I was mentioning, very smart young man, went to a top law school, was diagnosed about 10 months ago with ADHD, and he cannot let go. I have ADHD, and one of the things that I have said to him is, I hear that that has impacted you because it's a blow to his ego. And I have said to him, it might be helpful. And mind you, he is not in therapy as well, because I think it is very important that people who really struggle with their executive functioning skills also are in therapy, not just coaching with me. I'm not a therapist. But I have said, I think it would be great if you could make friends with your ADHD. Embrace it. That's not all who you are. I have anxiety. Is that all who I am? I'm so much more. You're so much more than a person with ADHD. And mind you, ADHD, super smart, highly creative, very spontaneous. But it's those things, and those are the things I cannot work with you on, as far as coming to accept the fact that I have this, and we tend to label ourselves. I have this, condition, disorder, and it doesn't mean my life will be horrible. But I think that's a very big piece for people, I believe. I really do.
We see that all the time when we have families who either rent or purchase a neurofeedback system,
Yeah.
and they're training a child with ADHD. And it's interesting because the beautiful thing that happens is that when they do the brain training, right, and they see their brains starting to be able to focus, when they have work in front of them, that's really such a strong message that it's not them, right, that is the problem, right? It's something going on in the brain, something they don't control. And so we
Yeah.
have the benefit when we catch it early, right? And children have the opportunity to get the supports in place, that self-esteem and that sense of self and that self-narrative doesn't grow about what is wrong with me. I'm a problem, because
Right.
you get to see that brain reset itself.
Well, separate from executive functioning, I learned a long time ago when I was a recruiter, and especially when I was coaching the young students at Rutgers Business School, that I believe the hardest part in when we're working on ourselves is staying resilient and staying positive. The hardest thing about job search, for instance, or the hardest thing about working on oneself with your executive functioning skills is staying with it and not allowing those thoughts or all the negative things that come into your head. It's managing oneself. It's managing our own feelings around how we view ourselves or how the world might view us. You know that as a therapist, obviously. And I see that a lot with the clients that I work with, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent. A lot. Yeah.
And so what are there sort of basic instructions or basic tips that you give everybody who's coming in with time management, focus issues, procrastination? And then a second question I have for you is, I want to talk a little bit about the daydreamers, because they don't get as much attention when we're talking about, these typical ADHD symptoms. But I'm curious, like what you have, or if you do have sort of standard tips that you encourage everybody to practice as like good executive functioning hygiene.
Great question. Yes. Again, dealing with someone who comes to me and really has issues around procrastination, but they're great with time management. The strategy might be different, and the routine, the process might be different. But there are a couple of things, it's a great question, that I think is really important, that I share a couple of tips. And that is, Rome wasn't discovered in a day. and if you're moving in the right direction, even little baby steps, you can see progress. Things do not change overnight because we've built up. We're talking about things that are habitual, a lifetime of being late, of having poor time management skills, or a lifetime of procrastinating and being disorganized doesn't change in 1 or 2 sessions. So it's recognizing that staying motivated, and that's an issue in itself. But and another piece that I think is very important is being kind with yourself, being gentle with yourself. It is easy to get frustrated. I get that. I really do. But I think that's a really big piece. And every little move in the right direction is a win, And that's how I work with my clients. A very small thing, and I'll say, great, you moved in the right direction. The needle's moving, great. Sometimes there are setbacks that, let's keep going, let's keep moving. And that's going to happen. That's almost natural. Things don't flow always the same way. And as far as I do talk about our self-talk, I'm very big with stuff like that, how the stories that we say to ourselves or what we say when we're upset with ourselves. And one of the things that I say to people is if someone makes an assumption about themselves, like this one, again, the same gentleman that I'm talking about, this client, he makes assumptions all the time about how people view him because he's ADHD. And I say to him, it's a thought in your mind. It's a thought. Thoughts are real, but they're not true most of the time. And you're making an assumption. And these are things that I work on with myself all the time. And I believe these to be true. And I really think by pausing midstream when getting upset and not feeling like you're making headway, to stop and say, what's going on here? And I'm spinning out, I'm having this thought, and it doesn't mean it's true. And making an assumption, that's another thing. We make a lot of assumptions, and I find a lot of people, a lot of clients I work with make certain assumptions about how they're perceived. And I'll say, stop, pause for a moment, and ask yourself, this assumption I'm making, do you know this to be 100% true with certainty? This is what I do. Everything that I share with my clients, I sometimes say, take the suggestions you give them, because we're all human and we all have these things that come up for us. I think these things are helpful.
So it sounds like that there are the baby steps that you want people to be practicing and valuing, whatever those baby steps are, whether it's, towards less procrastination or better time management, but also the attitude or the mindset that people are using is key. And so not to get discouraged and give up, not to assume that right, is perceiving them in a way that is negative or hostile, that would make them want to kind of move backwards rather than keep moving forwards. And really recognizing that mindset plays a role in whether or not you actually continue to practice whatever that new behavior is, or whether you give up on yourself.
When I talk about baby steps, for instance, I think especially with people with ADHD, it's easy to get discouraged. For instance, if you see that, I keep procrastinating, I can't do this. So I try to set goals, or don't do something that's unmanageable. Give yourself, it up, because then it becomes overwhelming. And when we get overwhelmed, we're not at our best. We start, it's an expression I use, we start to spin out. We get into that negative narrative. So set something that's doable and reachable so you can feel a little bit of movement in the right direction.
Yes.
Move in the right direction, and give yourself a little bit of a reward at the end of it. Step away from it. And actually, there is a technique, it's called a Pomodoro technique, where you set an alarm, you do something, a particular task for 25 minutes. The alarm goes off, you stop, you get up and you take a break for 10, and then you go back and you set the alarm. Little increments. If that's what it takes, you're moving in the right direction. And I understand people, we're wired, it seems like we're wired to want to get instant gratification. And then that is a piece with many people who have ADHD, impulsive and regulating their emotions. I want this now. It's like they need the dopamine and the serotonin
Yes.
rush. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, it's good that you brought up the emotional piece, and that's part of why I love the particular neurofeedback system that I use, because it shows the brain everything that's maladaptive in real time. So whether that maladaptive piece, and we're appreciating with, ADHD neurodivergence, it's not just cognitive, right? There's the emotional piece as well. And so when you show the brain everything in real time, whether it's emotional dysregulation, lack of focus, impulsivity, that brain gets to correct all of it in real time, which is, in part, I think how neurofeedback and the executive coaching go so well together. Because I use the analogy of like a snow globe, right? You shake up the snow globe, right? Very hard to see what's going on in that picture, right? But if it settles, right, then you can actually see, oh, these are the issues I have. This is where I'm trying to get to, right? So it's that regulated state that then allows us to follow through on what are the baby steps that we're practicing. And
I would say, and that was a great analogy, I would say that I think clarity with everything. I think clarity is so important, especially when someone is working on themselves, and it can be so overwhelming. So many of the clients I work with feel overwhelmed, and when they feel overwhelmed, then they get depressed. And if there's no clarity, it's all vague. And where do I start? It's like an insurmountable mountain.
And so
So
maybe that's a good question to ask, which is, where do you encourage people to start? Like if they're like, I don't know which of my issues I should start on, whether it's the fact I can't manage my time, or I can't seem to focus long enough on tasks, or I'm like easily distracted, or I'm being too impulsive. And where do you have any recommendations for starting points?
well, usually when I start with a client, they will come in just through the questioning, through the interviewing, and through my process. They will say they don't necessarily have all the executive functioning issues. It could be, usually it's one thing that is really massive in their life. And sometimes I will say, sometimes we'll work on one thing, and I'll say, what's going on? How are you doing? And they'll bring something up, and I'll say, well, what are you working on? How are you working on that to rectify this issue? And they'll say, well, I don't know. And so I'll say, well, for instance, I'll give an example here. I had a client, a very bright man, and probably, who's been in business for a long time. And it was really interesting. It was like almost like a learning thing on my part. He and I met twice a week, and it was often around his incredibly, incredibly busy schedule. His life was one massive schedule, personally and professionally. And he just didn't know where to begin. And one day I said to him, let's pause for a moment. You don't know how to plan the next few days. What is a priority? What's a priority for you? And he didn't know what a priority was. And this is a man who was in business, not for himself. He was a businessman, very bright. not even knowing how to, when I set a reminder, he asked me because I said, I use this. This is a great reminder for me. I live by this personally and professionally. If I didn't set, you can set the time for something, but if you don't set the notification to remind you, how are you going to remember, especially if you have issues with memory? And he said, I don't know how, even how much of a reminder I need. So I said, well, what task is really important here in your planning of the next few days? Well, how do I know what's a priority? I'll say, okay, so I gave him, I said, well, I think a priority could be something that was due as of yesterday, or something that involves someone else, someone else's time. Something that is really super important to the company you're working for, or personally. Something that if you don't get to will have a really negative consequence. So it's like, it really sometimes just takes breaking down and asking a lot of questions. How have you struggled with this? What have you done? Let's try something else that looks like it might work. As far as managing your time, you don't know how, you're always late for things. Do you have a system in place? Do you have reminders? Do you use an alarm? No. I don't know how you function in the world. And that's what comes up, because I think people, when they come to me, they don't have any kind of systems. There are apps for people who have ADHD. Not all the people I work with use them at all. And I ask them, what do you think, knowing yourself, will work for you? If you have a to-do list and it's overwhelming, all the things that you have to take care of, will putting it in a Google Doc be good for you? It's not what's good for me, it's what's good for you. What's going to work for you? I'll tell you what's worked for me, but this is about you. And some people will say, well, I have a running list, which is often what I do. Okay, and what do you do when you've completed the task? Do you check it off? No. How do you remember that you did it? Necessarily, if you have memory issues as well. Yeah. It's really, really breaking it down in many ways.
And I'm hearing too, like, what is the biggest pain point, right? And starting with what causes the most discomfort could be a good place to start.
Yes, it's interesting, because the biggest, as I said before, the biggest piece that is most difficult for the clients I've worked with is procrastination and initiating a task. And I think, you may even have, as a therapist, you may have an interesting perspective on this, but what is it about initiating that is so hard for people? And I'm thinking of another client who was on the spectrum, okay? And he was a very talented artist. And he came to me, and I asked him, I said, well, why do you want to work with me? What are you what's been going on? How do you think I can help you? Let's work on something, what are the areas that are really calling you, need your attention? And he said, well, I haven't worked on my portfolio in a long time. And some people have no answers. I'll say, oh, what's been going on? Have you haven't? He says, I don't know. And I figured out he probably was very scared to face himself, to face his fear of failure. And he worked as an artist. He did. He had a steady client, but he was so scared of starting. So we meet on, most of my clients I meet on Zoom, and I asked him, I said, can I see some of your work if you're comfortable? And he showed me some of his work online, and I could tell he was so proud of it. And he's even been in galleries. So I said, so maybe, why don't we start with what would you like to work on now in your portfolio? And he said, I'm really bad at doing hands, drawing hands. I said, so he showed me some of what he had done. And then I said to him, do you think, I said, so let's set a goal for when I meet you on Friday. Start with some hands. That's kind of an easier place for you to start. You can ease into it. And he did. And his goal was he wanted to go out and network so he could get his name out there, so he could get more work, because networking was socialization was a very big piece for him. Terrified to talk to people, yeah. But feeling good about representing himself as an artist and facing that this was scary for him to start after ignoring his portfolio.
Right. Yeah. So again, that intersection between one's emotional life, right, and ideas or fears about oneself, and then one's ability to go into action, right, to go towards the goals that people have professionally in this case.
I would say the majority of the people, or many men, I'm not going to say majority, many people I have worked with have self-esteem issues. And I'm talking about people with ADHD, especially. Many of us, I've worked with many people who, they lack confidence in their interview skills, and those are the things that often, it's how we see and view ourselves that often it impacts us. It totally impacts us, what goes on up here. Yeah. So I'm very cognizant of that. And while I'm not a therapist and I can't go there, I really,
You're recognizing that plays a role, and that people need to be aware of the role it's playing, right? Whether they work that out on their own or they get into therapy or whatever, but just, helping them to see the full picture of what are creating the obstacles for them. I think it also just goes to what you were speaking of before, which is, that sense of like putting ourselves out there, and that it does raise our fear.
yes, I know.
And people who've had ADHD for a long time, that's impacted their sense of self, right? That I'm a problem, or I'm not as good as. And so that becomes, that kind of what makes us put on the brakes, at least from the mental health point of view, right? Is when you have that story, right? It invites the freeze response of the fight, flight, freeze, right? Because it's like, oh, don't go forward. There's danger. You're going to get hurt. And so that freeze response becomes and that's part of the brain we don't control. Like many of the cluster of ADHD symptoms, right? We're talking about areas of the brain that are not the prefrontal cortex, which is our willful brain, right? That's our ability to create a plan and follow through on the plan. And so I think it's, it's a challenge because it's multifaceted. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, and we are such multifaceted beings. We really are. And how I see that when I was coaching, when I was a recruiter, and now when as an executive function coach, that we so often get in our own way. We all do this. And I don't know that everybody is aware that they do that, but that's part of it seems like that's part of our human condition. And what I feel I can bring, what I try to bring when I see that going on is, you don't have to do everything all at once. It's a process. We're all a process in work. We're all a process. And I understand that, you want to be there already. But it's, to me, and I say this for myself as well, there are things that challenge me, and I say, one step at a time. If we feel overwhelmed, we do nothing.
Right. Yes.
That's the alternative. That's what happens with people. Doing nothing changes. And that's the piece for me as a coach that can be difficult, because I try to impart that I understand this is not always easy. We tend to label ourselves, I have ADHD or I have this, and which is so unfair. We do this as people. We label everybody, and we give ourselves a label, and then we're stuck with that, and we get attached to it, and then we get stuck, and we get in our own way. And I mean, from what I know, and every single person I have worked with, every single person I've worked with, most of them are extremely smart.
Right, right.
So capable, so capable. So if I can feed that to them through the screen, and I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to be a coach. I think we don't get enough of that when we're in life. So because the negativity bias, we hear the things we don't do right.
Right.
I think it's important to hear the things we do right, and that's what coaches do. And we're cheerleaders. And if I can be that for someone, because I know that there are a lot of struggles and it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time to work through them because we're habitual creatures and we're working through trying to work past habits that have been formed, neurodivergent or neurotypical, right?
And so, how many young women do you work with? Do you find that it's more men who come forward wanting help with their ADHD? And if you see women, what kind of differences do you see?
That's an interesting question. I have worked with more men. And I thought that very interesting, especially in the neurodivergent executive functioning realm. Yes. I have worked with women. I currently, the student I'm talking about who's in London, who has 24 hours a week just of required reading, I think the difference is that they have the same issues, the same executive function issues. It's their approach and their being able to open up with me. And I think that the women I have worked with are, I think they're more transparent about what they're feeling. And even though I'm not supposed to talk about what you're feeling because I'm not a therapist, if someone comes to me into a session and I can see they're really upset, I'm not going to say, how did that go? Did you accomplish that goal this week? I'll say, what's going on? What's going on? Because we're human.
Yes.
And I think it is harder. But I have worked with a lot of men. I've worked with a lot of men. Interestingly. And it's an interesting question because I don't know if I've really thought about that myself. How different might it be working? What might the difference be working with men, working with women?
Well, what made me think of it was when you were talking about self-esteem, because I know the research shows that girls with ADHD, it impacts their self-esteem much more than it does boys. They have a much higher pregnancy rate as young adults. They earn a lot less money than ADHD young men do. And so I'm sort of aware that the self-esteem issue it seems to be a bigger factor for girls and young women with
It
ADHD.
could just be the women and the young women that I have worked with are just have not, like the one I'm working with currently, the one who's has all this reading and she's in this heavy academic archaeology program. She's very self-assured because she's brilliant. And not that means you're self-assured always at all, but she doesn't have those. She doesn't suffer from poor self-esteem. My experience has been with the men that I've worked with and how that impacts their work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing, or I'm a partner in a relationship, or I have a family and how this impacts my family.
Right.
But that's something very interesting for me to think about because I don't think I've ever been asked that question. And I know that I think statistically more men are diagnosed with,
Absolutely, absolutely.
yes. So maybe that's why I see more men.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, yeah.
Well, it's something for us to all think about. Um, well, Laura, I see we're at the top of the hour here, and I know somebody asked a question asking for your contact info. I'm going to send out a follow-up email with the recording, how you can get in touch with Laura. So all of that will be in a follow-up email tomorrow. But Laura, thank you so much for
Thank you.
spending your Monday evening with us, enlightening us about how to support executive functioning skills in our neurodivergent community. And thank you everyone who joined us and who's going to watch the recording. We're here for you. Please reach out to myself or Laura if you have any follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Natalie. Appreciate it. And thank you
Absolutely.
everyone for being here. Yeah, great.
My pleasure. All right,
Thank
everybody,
you.
I hope you have a good evening. Take care.